Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Psalm 65, a harvest hymn. We begin with the superscription for the choir director, a psalm of David, a song. We're going to actually see this arrangement a few different times, but this is going to be a fairly short psalm. And now the psalm begins, "There will be silence before you." And notice how you have that line, and then the next line, "And praise in Zion, O God." Um, those two lines I'm going to suggest go together and really are sort of saying the same thing, but in two different ways. And so that term "there will be silence before you" seems to be a figure of speech. That's the way most translations take it. The King James as well as the NIV give "praise awaits you." In other words, this is the the you've heard the term "the calm before the storm." This is the pause between the praise. So praise awaits you, or the ESV has it, praise is due to you. But the idea, and I think they're getting the idea from the context, and maybe they know more than I do about this figure of speech, because I can't recall ever seeing it anywhere else. But I think they're right about it being a figure of speech. And so that's probably the idea there behind the phrase. And yet, notice the translations that I mentioned all translated it literally. No, I take it back. The New American Standard that we're reading here translated it literally. They rendered it with the meaning behind the phrase. And I think they're probably right, although I'm not going to fault the New American Standard for being too literal. Let me just say that's one of the arguments against the New American Standard is that sometimes it's too literal, and that's the very thing I like about it. But also that can be a problem because it obscures the meaning, like here. I think that might be a true charge. So notice it continues, and to you, speaking of the Lord, we're speaking to him, and to you the vow will be performed. O you who hear prayer, that's a great title for God. He is the God who hears prayer. Uh, o you who hear prayer, to you all men come. And so notice we're opening on a idea of praise and thanksgiving. Verse 3 gives us the only negative part in this entire short psalm. Iniquities prevail against me. As for our transgressions, you forgive them. Notice the symmetry again here. Iniquities and transgressions, that's two different ways of describing the same thing. In the first line, they prevailed against me. It looks like they're going to overwhelm. But the good news, as for our transgressions, you forgive them. And so, yes, sin would win, except we have a forgiver who is bigger than our sin, and he has taken care of them. Of course, that's what the cross is all about. How God sent His Son to die in our place to pay the penalty for our sin, so that they can be forgiven, and yet God is still just in doing so. Verse 4, how blessed is the one whom you choose and bring near to you. And notice, to dwell in your courts. This is temple language. And so when you talk about the courts, that's referring to the temple. Um, we will be satisfied with the goodness of your house. And in case you didn't know, notice, and then he gets specific, your holy temple. And so here's the picture of praise. And where do you hear praise? Well, you go to the temple. That's the place where God is, where He is manifested. And you go to those courts and to His house and to the temple, and that's where you find God's people, because the duty of God's people are to come and praise Him. Verse 5, by awesome deeds you answer us in righteousness. Now notice the word deeds, and I think the idea is there. But the word is italicized, and that's our translator's way of telling us that they have added that word to be helpful. And I think it is. I think they're right, and then you're going to see it in the context. But actually, the term here, uh, nu ra'oth, it's the nifl participle of yara, and yara is just the basic word to fear. Now, sometimes it can talk about being afraid of somebody. Sometimes it can be talking about the fear of the Lord. And so this is why they rendered it awesome. Fearful deeds. I think the New American Standard, or I'm sorry, the Old King James might say terrible deeds. Again, to capture that fearful idea. And the fear of the Lord is a regular theme in both Psalms and Proverbs And sometimes we say, well, that's our awe of God, and that's true. But it's okay if there's a little fear in there, because God is really big, and we're not, and He does whatever He likes, and it's not always to our way of thinking. So by awesome fill in the blank deeds works, you answer us in righteousness, O God. And notice we're speaking to God now. Before we were speaking about Him, now we're speaking to Him. O God of our salvation, another great title for God. You who are the trust of all the ends of the earth and of the furthest sea. In other words, here's the God of our salvation. Here is the God, but He's not just the God of the mountaintops. He's not just the God of Jerusalem. He's not just this little tribal God that's way out in the middle of nowhere, but He is the one who He's seen to the ends of the earth and of the farthest sea, who establishes the mountains by His strength, being girded with might, who stills the roaring of the seas, the roaring of their waves. And remember, the Jewish people, the Israelites, they looked at the ocean as a very dangerous place. They were from the mountains. It's not that God is just the God of the mountains, but they were from the mountains. They were comfortable. They saw themselves as a desert people and a mountain people. Um, and the sea, that was that far off place. You never knew what it was going to do. And notice the roaring of their waves and the tumult of the peoples. And when he talks about the peoples, that's the point, is that God is the God of everyone, not just a tribal God, not just Jewish God, not just the God of the mountains. He's God of everywhere and everyone, whether they recognize Him or not. We continue verse 8. They who dwell in the ends of the earth, we already talked about that. Stand in awe. Again, that's our our old friend, the Calum Perfect, this time the Vav consecutive of Yirah, fear. Um, and again, who are fearful, but I think awe is the right idea. It's not just that they're afraid of your signs. Oh my goodness, there's a sign of God and I better leave. No, it's not necessarily a sign, a fear that drives away. It can also be a fear that brings you near. And I think that's the case here in this case. You say, wait a minute, they who dwell in the ends of the earth are in awe of God's signs. Not just the people that are local, not just the people the Israelites know, but in the ends of the earth. And you find out in the Bible that that's true, that there are people that had been far away from the Israelite people, that were not connected with them, and yet heard and saw the things that God did and the things that God was. He is the creator. They saw creation. They heard about some of the things that He did. I think, for example, about how the Canaanites had heard about what God did, not in Canaan, but back in Egypt, like a long way away from them, at least the way they figured it. And yet they had come to fear that God. Now, sometimes they feared Him in a way that made Him want to resist that God, and sometimes they feared Him in a way that they wanted to join with that God and worship Him. And so both, I think, are in view here. Notice, still speaking to God, you make the dawn and the sunset, the dawn and the sunset, the day and the night, the every place, the every time, you make them shout for joy. Verse 9, you visit the earth and cause it to overflow. You greatly enrich it. Let's say, you enrich it. The stream of God. Now, the phrase about the stream of God, that can be um, a couple of different things. It can be maybe a river, and that would work. Although I think the term there, if I remember correctly, can be used of a canal, some sort of artificial stream. I don't think that's really specific either way. But that term there, the Peleg, actually, you remember there was a descendant of Noah by the name of Peleg, and it meant to divide. And for in his day, the earth was divided, probably looking back at the Tower of Babel. Well, when it talks about the stream, it's the Peleg, the division. And so, yes, this can refer to not just a river, but it can refer to a canal. Um, and the stream of God is full of water. You prepare their grain, and thus you prepare the earth. You water its furrows. So this is farming language. This is why I think maybe canal might be in view here. And so this is the farming language this is the God who provides the resources for day-to-day living, for farming. Remember, this is an agricultural community. So you prepare their grain, you prepare the earth in which you grow the grain, you water its furrows abundantly, you settle its ridges, you soften it with showers, you bless its growth. You take care of the growth that people need to live in this agricultural world in which they live. Verse 11, you have crowned the year with your bounty. And it's interesting. That word bounty it's a lot easier than that. It's just the word tov. In this case, your bounty. So tobetheska. Uh, but bounty is just the word tov. You're good, literally. Now, good is a real general word in Hebrew, and you can get a lot of mileage out of tov. So your bounty would be a more English way of expressing it. In other words, you crown the year with all the good that you, in context, that you gave to the farmers. Notice, and your paths drip with fatness. Um, the pastures of the wilderness drip, and the hills gird themselves with rejoicing. The meadows are clothed with flocks. The valleys are covered with grain. They shout for joy. Yes, they sing. And notice how the land, or in particular the farms, the place where things are growing, are personified. They're getting dressed, they're going to worship, they're shouting, they're singing, all of these things are taking place. And of course, this is figurative language. It reminds us, and we'll close on this note with the words of the Apostle Paul, 2 Corinthians chapter 9, where he speaks about how he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food, and we're speaking of God, will supply and multiply your seed for sowing and increase the harvest of your righteousness. Now, notice, he's using farming language, but in this case, they're not necessarily physical farmers. These are the Corinthians. They lived in a big city. And so the one who does all those things for farmers, seed to the sower, bread for food, may he multiply your seed for sowing and increase the harvest of your not of your farms, of your righteousness. It's talking about sowing spiritual seed. Verse 11, you will be enriched in everything for all liberality, which through us is producing a crop. Here it is, thanksgiving to God. And that's how we started this psalm, and that's how we're ending it as well.